So welcome back to this second lecture on women in the Renaissance. And at the end of the last lecture, I believe we were talking about love versus contract, and we were discussing the idea of the matchmakers creating matches between eligible women and men, and then the idea of a bride price as established in the term of dowry. That was quite important to regulating the process of marriage. And again, I want to remind everybody that we're talking about the families of means, so we're not talking about the lower classes or orders of society. So let's continue on. The first time that a prospective couple actually met typically took place at Mass, and you see there a picture of a large church in Europe, and that was the meeting place. So people were surrounded by families and friends. Everybody was dressed up in their best clothes, and it was all very, very public. And if the parties then agreed that the match was in fact viable, the last phase of the marriage arrangement was the hammering out of the contract. And this is the biggest item in terms of the marriage. And the biggest item in the contract was the dowry, that is the cash, land, jewelry, and or other items that would be transferred to the husband's family, though not permanently. And the husband, on the other hand, had to agree that he would take whatever was in the dowry and use it wisely. If it were money, invest it, land, he would continue to work the land so that it would continue to be a source of profit. So those are the contractual obligations. The girl's family provides, the groom's family agrees to use the money and or other objects well and keep them safe. So, as I said, an interesting side note is dowries were not an outright transfer of property from the bride's family to the groom's family. The property actually remained in the bride's family, and this was so that if the groom were to die, that property, that dowry, would revert back to the bride's family, and then the bride would have something to help sustain her, and that was a very important function then of this dowry. And the system really, as I said before, ensured stability in society, and it was geared towards the family, and the family really was as we said before, a patriarchal institution. So there's not a lot of freedom or independence for women at all. And then one last thing about dowries: if a family didn't have enough money for a dowry, maybe they were a well-to-do family that had fallen on hard times, something like that, which was quite frequent actually. They could borrow money from one of the banking families, or ask for charity from one of these banking families. And in fact, this is one of the ways that the Medici family rose to power in Florence when Cosimo de' Medici, back in the 14th and then 15th centuries, began providing dowry payments to Florentine girls whose parents, whose families lacked the means. And in this way, Cosimo created a vast network of citizens who were loyal supporters of the Medici family, and that was really the foundation, or one of the foundations of their power that they were to exercise for close to 200 years in the city of Florence. So the last stage of the marriage is the signing of the contract that you see there pictured, and the husband and wife did this publicly. They agreed. They made statements in public that they were going to marry. This would be done in front of witnesses, and then this contract would be signed. So at this point, the marriage is complete. Somewhat unlike what we're used to today, where marriage ceremonies take place in a church in the presence of a minister, a priest, etc., rabbi. This is not necessarily the case, so it's really more of a contract. Therefore, contract wins over all else in terms of marriage, and this is really what kind of regulates women and men too. But at this point, women really don't have as much independence, although I'm not sure men had as much independence as we would like to think they did either. Certainly, I think that the cards were stacked against women in many ways. So, and I just mentioned that. So, marriage, let's just review. The glue that kept society together. The social and economic needs of the family trumped all considerations of feeling and emotion. Later, we'll see in the late 18th and then early 19th centuries what we'll call the Romantic movement that's going to really shift the emphasis from the contractual foundations of marriage to a more emotional foundation that we're more familiar with today. So marriage then became a diplomatic art that allowed families and even whole nations to thrive and grow in power and in status. And in fact, historians will often refer to something called marriage diplomacy, and that is the sons and daughters of the kings and emperors are married off to other families in other nations and city-states that will produce a broader, expand territory and produce a broader power base for the family and for the kingdom and or city-state. So marriage was a serious business, especially at the higher levels of society. The other thing that you see there, divorce was not an option. There was annulment in canon law, theological law, in special cases, but not often. In fact, King Henry VIII of England was trying desperately to get an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and he was denied and refused, and what a ruckus that caused. And then just lastly, the marriage of common women, peasants. Few documents exist, as common people were not literate, though, again, there may be church records that could provide useful information about, for example, the average age of marriage. But at this point, there's not as much known at the lower levels of society. So let's move on then. Attitudes towards women in general. And I think the artwork there will help explain what we are talking about. So we see on the left-hand side a religious painting inspired by the book of Genesis and the famous scene in the Garden of Eden where we have the tree of knowledge and the fruit, the apple, representing knowledge. We see the serpent there coiled up in the tree and really it seems clear that the serpent is talking to Eve. Eve then grabs one of the apples, hands it to Adam, who's sort of standing there scratching his head like, this looks good. Give it a try. And so that sets in motion this centuries-long attitude nurtured and perpetuated by the church that women were the cause of original sin. And that's going to be very difficult for women to sort of overcome over the centuries. And that being said, what did the humanists do, though? I mean, the humanists were the ones that went back to classical Greece and Rome and read the texts looking for information and clues about how to live a good life, how to live a happy life. And they were very successful in many ways in doing that. What about the humanists' attitude towards women? Well, this is not a happy story. Aristotle, who's pictured in Raphael's School of Athens in the fresco on the right, and Aristotle, I believe, is the figure on the right who's holding a book, something that he wrote pointing somewhat down towards the earth. Aristotle wrote this, that women were a mistake during pregnancy. And this is pretty damning, right? And women were a mistake during pregnancy. So something went wrong during pregnancy, which led to the birth of a female child and not a male child. And consequently, women were often seen as weak, irrational, hysterical, and that therefore they had to be closely supervised by men. So again, we're going to see the response then of the patriarchal church, the patriarchal society in the Italian peninsula, and the humanists, that women somehow need to be controlled. And if we remember, too, going back to Roman law, women could be punished under Roman law as slaves. So, yikes. And this is something that didn't necessarily happen, but the attitude of the Romans towards women was also one that they were not to be trusted, that they needed to be strictly supervised and punished if they in some way stepped out of line or over certain boundaries. So this is not a happy story for women, generally speaking. And it also leads to what we've already talked about in class, that women didn't need a great education. They needed to learn the basics to keep their husbands company. They needed to learn how to run a household. They might read books of prayers and the lives of saints to help them in their devotion to God and the church. but they certainly didn't need an extended education beyond that. And in fact, many thought it was dangerous to educate women, that this would interfere with their natural biological role of bearing children. And so it's really not until much later, I mean, even the 19th century in the United States, that we see, again, the appearance of all-female colleges. Bryn Mawr College is a great example. That didn't come into existence until the 19th century, where people began to challenge the centuries-old idea that women were somehow a mistaken man, and that women could not achieve the same goals and the same results as males. So, as always, however, before we end, there are exceptions to the rule, and they're few and they're far between. But Laura Cerreta was a highly educated girl on the left, and she married as a teenager, as you would expect, came from a very good family, and her father provided her a good education. Well, her husband died soon after their marriage, and for a time she was able to turn her attention to scholarly pursuits, writing and publishing letters, until her own father died, and she lost then the support and patronage of her father. But she's worth noting, and her works are important, and we can read them, and we would if we did have more time. In the field of art, we have Sonafisba Anguissola, whose long life and achievements in the field of pictorial art, especially doing portraits of various people, allowed her to rise to great fame in Europe. And again, art was a field dominated by males, and so here's a female artist who achieved great things. And you might say, well, how about recognition? How about equal pay, maybe? No. So the number of women, again, that did achieve success were few. And this is the last thing we'll end with, the great irony. The free republics of Florence and Venice really didn't treat women all that well. They tended to reinforce the patriarchal notion that women needed to be closely supervised, that women were, in fact, subsidiary. And rather, it's in the principalities such as Urbino, pictured on the left, Mantua, and others, that we're going to see several great women, such as Elisabetta Gonzaga of Mantua, Isabella d'Este of Ferrara, Lucrezia Borgia, who was the daughter of a pope, Alexander VI, and then she went on to marry somebody in the Milanese court. So there is this really interesting irony that principalities ruled by princes and or kings provided a greater pathway to a few women to achieve great fame, notoriety, and good things. So at this point, if you have any questions about women in the Renaissance, please jot them down and let me know, and thank you very much.